Tonight, as the world settles into silence, we drift back, not just through centuries, but into an era blanketed in mystery. A time so shrouded in shadows that historians once dared to call it the Dark Ages. But what if that darkness wasn't real? What if the greatest cover-up in history wasn't about what happened, but what didn't? You're lying comfortably now. Let your shoulders sink into the pillow, take a deep breath, and let it go slowly. We're about to journey through a version of the past that may not be as it seemed. A past rewritten not with swords, but with stories. A world between the fall of Rome and the rise of the Renaissance, where truth and myth blend like mist on the moors. Historians called it a 1,000-year sleep. But was it really? Tonight, we're not just exploring history. We're gently untangling the story of how history itself was shaped. By politics, by progress, by pride. So close your eyes, and imagine walking through the ruins of an old stone city. The wind stirs ivy through broken marble columns. A raven caws in the distance. Somewhere, a candle still flickers beside a forgotten book. Welcome to the story of the so-called Dark Ages. Once, there was Rome. A sprawling empire that stretched from misty Britain to the sands of Arabia. Its roads carved through continents, its aqueducts carried water for miles, and its laws echoed across time. But Rome did not fall in a day. It crumbled, slowly, like a tired giant kneeling down, overwhelmed by time. By the 5th century, barbarian tribes were no longer just invading Rome, they were becoming part of it. The Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, they weren't merely destroyers, they were also settlers, rulers, adapters of the Roman way of life. Still, the old empire fractured. The Western Roman Empire, what we think of as Rome, collapsed in 476 AD, when a boy emperor named Romulus Augustulus was deposed by a Germanic general. And so, the curtain fell. Or so the story goes. Let your breathing slow here, but ask yourself, did the world truly fall into darkness? The Eastern Roman Empire, based in Constantinople, lived on for another 1,000 years. It had libraries, trade, diplomacy, art. It preserved ancient texts that would later inspire the Renaissance. Yet for centuries, it was largely ignored by Western storytellers. Why? Because the fall of the Western Roman Empire made a better tale, a cleaner break between civilized Rome and barbaric Europe. That's where the myth begins. In the aftermath of Rome's fall, power shifted. Local rulers, bishops, and warlords rose from the rubble. Some became petty kings. Others built churches and towns. And yet the narrative became one of loss. Roman baths fell silent. Forums crumbled. Roads went untended. Latin splintered into local dialects. But even in those shadows, life went on. People farmed, prayed, traded, loved, fought, adapted. Imagine a small village in 6th century Gaul. Children play near a stream. A woman grinds grain by hand, passing on skills learned generations before. A priest teaches boys to read, not Greek philosophy perhaps, but the Psalms, the Gospel and law. Darkness, or simply, a different light. Breathe in, and release. We tend to think of the past in absolutes. Light and dark, progress and decline. But history doesn't always follow a clean timeline. It's more like a tapestry. Threads woven from different peoples, languages and dreams. In this early medieval world, the church grew stronger. Not just in religion, but in administration, art, and education. Monasteries became centers of learning, copying manuscripts by candlelight, while wolves howled outside. Was it the end of civilization? Or just a transformation? By the 8th century, trade routes reawakened. Viking ships cut through northern waters, Arab scholars lit up cities from Baghdad to Cordoba, Slavic kingdoms rose in the east. And in the British Isles, monks created shimmering, illuminated texts like the Book of Kells. If this was a dark time, it certainly glimmered in places. But the Renaissance thinkers, centuries later, needed a story. One where they, the artists and scientists of Florence and Paris, had risen from a pit of ignorance. So they named the past dark, not because it truly was, but because it made their world seem brighter. As we move deeper into the past, the shadows seem to thicken. This is where the label Dark Ages begins to take hold. But who first called it dark? The phrase wasn't whispered by monks or spoken by kings of the time. It came much later, from the pens of Renaissance scholars in the 14th and 15th centuries. To them, The 1,000 years between the fall of Rome and their present seemed like a void, a gap in greatness. A time with no sculptures like Michelangelo's, no science like Galileo's, no poetry like Dante's. They looked back and saw silence. But was it truly so? Let your breath steady here. The world may have seemed dimmer, but it was never still. The early medieval period, from about 500 to 1000 AD, was a time of realignment. Cities shrank, but communities grew around monasteries, castles, and market towns. Roman law faded, but new legal systems developed, like the Salic Code among the Franks, or the customary laws of the Anglo-Saxons. And the darkness? That was mostly a lack of records. Rome had scribes and scrolls. The Middle Ages had parchment and patience. It's true that fewer written works survive from these centuries. Fires destroyed some. Time erased others. But absence doesn't mean nothing happened. It only means we can't always see it. Close your eyes and imagine. A quiet stone monastery nestled in the hills of Ireland. Inside, a young monk dips a quill into ink. By candlelight he copies the Psalms in Latin, decorating each letter with gold leaf, animals and curling vines. Outside, sheep graze. Bells toll in the mist. This is not darkness. This is preservation. This is care. This is light in a different form. Elsewhere the Arab world blossomed. While Europe rebuilt, cities like Baghdad, Damascus and Cairo grew into centers of learning. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad housed scholars who translated ancient Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic, preserving Aristotle, Hippocrates and Ptolemy, long before they returned to the West. Meanwhile in Spain, under Muslim rule, Córdoba became a glittering city with libraries, paved streets, and public baths. Yet Renaissance writers, focusing on their own triumphs, left these achievements in the margins. To them, only their rediscovery of ancient Rome and Greece mattered. They erased the links in the chain. They made the Middle Ages seem like a chasm, but chasms are often bridges in disguise. There were wars, yes, famines, plagues, crusades. But there was also resilience, a reshaping of identity, languages that evolved, traditions that adapted, people who remembered and retold their past in new ways. Let yourself relax into that thought. The Dark Ages were never completely dark. They were a tunnel, not a tomb. One of the most misleading myths is that people in the early Middle Ages believed the world was flat. In truth, educated scholars, especially those in the church, knew otherwise. As early as the 7th century, the Venerable Bede, a monk in Northumbria, wrote about the earth as a sphere. Even earlier, Saint Isidore of Seville compiled a vast encyclopedia that, though flawed in parts, aimed to preserve Roman knowledge. His work, Etymologiae, became one of the most copied books of the early medieval world. The real darkness wasn't in knowledge itself. It was in how later generations described that knowledge. Like walking into a candlelit room and declaring it empty just because it's quiet. There's a stillness to the early Middle Ages. A sense of resetting. Empires ended. But people endured. They built anew, smaller, slower, yes, but no less meaningful. Breathe in here. And out. The past isn't as dark as it once seemed. It only needed more light. As your breathing softens and the night deepens, we enter a chapter filled with silence. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the voices were hidden. What was truly lost when Rome fell? Not just buildings or borders. Not just gold or glory, but knowledge. Or so we're told. There's a long-held belief that the ancient world's intellectual treasures vanished during the early Middle Ages. That libraries burned. That scholars scattered. That centuries of insight simply disappeared. But is that really the whole truth? Close your eyes and imagine the Grand Library of Alexandria, its scrolls, its philosophers, its star maps. We often mourn it as the symbol of all that was lost. But Alexandria's fall happened long before the Middle Ages truly began. And even then, knowledge didn't vanish. It moved. It journeyed. It waited. Let your body sink deeper into rest. Roman engineering, Greek medicine, Babylonian astronomy. These didn't cease to exist. They were translated, reinterpreted, stored in monasteries and mosques, whispered from teacher to student, copied in ink on fragile parchment. In the East, Byzantine scholars preserved classical texts, sometimes verbatim, sometimes filtered through Christian thought. These scribes kept alive the histories of Herodotus, the philosophies of Plato, and the science of Ptolemy. In the Islamic world, knowledge flourished. Arab mathematicians invented algebra, refined algorithms, and introduced the concept of zero. They catalogued stars, advanced optics, and compiled vast medical encyclopedias. Much of this was based on Greek sources, but also on original thought, experimentation, and curiosity. Even in Europe, knowledge persisted, though it changed shape. In monasteries, monks became guardians of literacy. They copied religious texts, yes, but also legal documents, classical fragments, and natural philosophy. In Ireland, scribes illuminated manuscripts with breathtaking care. In Italy, some libraries never closed. What was lost was never total. More like threads coming loose from an old garment. Some fell away, others were rewoven into new patterns. Let's not forget, loss is not the same as erasure. When we say knowledge disappeared, we often mean we stopped looking for it in the places it moved to. For example, while Europe focused on feudal lords and church councils, scholars in Baghdad debated Aristotle. While northern kings learned to write their names, libraries in Córdoba held thousands of volumes. But those places were seen as other, foreign. Outside the narrative Renaissance, Europe wanted to tell about itself. So the myth grew that there had been a total blackout of learning, a complete collapse into ignorance. But here, in this quiet hour, you know better. History isn't always lost. Sometimes, it's just misfiled. Sometimes, it's hidden in plain sight. There's another reason we believe so much was lost, because what was preserved came with filters. Medieval thinkers often interpreted classical ideas through the lens of religion. Astronomy became a way to understand divine order. Medicine followed Galen's humors but was constrained by theological boundaries. Yet within these boundaries, innovation still sparked. Roger Bacon experimented with optics. Hildegard of Bingen wrote on healing herbs. The foundation for the scientific revolution was being laid, not with thunder, but with gentle chiseling. The cover-up wasn't a deliberate conspiracy by a single person or group. It was more subtle. A shift in perspective. A forgetting that happened slowly, and then all at once. One age rewrote another to serve its own image. And so, the knowledge wasn't destroyed, but reframed. Let yourself drift through this thought. The past is not a straight line. It loops, it echoes, it sleeps. And sometimes it wakes again. And all that was lost? Much of it, perhaps, was never gone at all. The fire never went out. It just flickered, low, quiet, and hidden, until someone came along to fan the flame. That someone was Charlemagne. Let your thoughts drift to the snowy forests of medieval Europe. It's the year 800. The Western world is fragmented. Kingdoms rise and fall like waves. But in the heart of this shifting landscape, a powerful Frankish king dreams of unity. His name is Charles, Carolus Magnus. But history remembers him as Charlemagne. He could not read or write, not fluently, not at first. And yet he ruled over a realm that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube, from the North Sea to the Alps. A kingdom born not just of conquest, but of culture. Imagine riding with Charlemagne's court, winding along forested roads, through stone villages and walled abbeys. At night, torches glow in tents. Scholars speak Latin by firelight. Priests carry books wrapped in cloth and tied with leather cords. This was not a man content with swords alone. Charlemagne believed in learning, in books, in building bridges to the past. And so began what historians call the Carolingian Renaissance. It wasn't a golden age of high science or global discovery, but it was something perhaps more important, a renewal. A choice to preserve, protect, and pass on the wisdom of the past. Charlemagne surrounded himself with scholars from across Europe, most notably Alcuin of York, an Anglo-Saxon monk who became the intellectual architect of his court. Alcuin helped standardize Latin grammar, train scribes, and restore lost texts. Scriptoria, writing rooms in monasteries, multiplied. Monks developed a clear, rounded script, called Carolingian minuscule, which made reading easier. It's the ancestor of the modern typefaces you see today. Through Charlemagne's vision, ancient knowledge became accessible again, not just to kings and bishops, but to future generations. Let that thought comfort you. Even in dark times, someone always carries a candle. Breathe deeply now. Under Charlemagne, schools were established, not just for the noble elite, but for boys in cathedral towns and abbeys. These schools taught reading, arithmetic, music, and religious texts. Latin was the key, connecting past to present, Rome to Aachen. This was a kind of revival, yes, but it wasn't nostalgic. Charlemagne didn't want to recreate the Roman Empire. He wanted to inherit its soul. In the year 800, on Christmas Day, he entered the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome. There, Pope Leo III placed a golden crown on his head and declared him Emperor of the Romans. It was a symbolic act, one that said, Rome lives on, but not in marble palaces. In ideas, in books, in belief. Let your breath slow as you picture that scene. Incense rising, choirs echoing through stone arches, the candlelight of 1,000 watchers reflecting on golden robes. A moment when the Middle Ages did not seem dark at all. Charlemagne's empire would not last forever. His grandsons would divide it. Warfare and invasions would continue. But the seeds he planted endured. Through his efforts, Europe remembered that it had once known greatness, that it could learn again, that it could rise again. That light was possible, even in a world wrapped in shadow. And so the myth of the Dark Ages begins to tremble. For if there was light in Charlemagne's time, was the darkness ever real? Or was it simply misunderstood? Breathe softly now. We've passed through emperors and empires. Let's pause and sit with the myths. Because the Middle Ages, the so-called Dark Ages, are tangled in misunderstanding. Not just historical errors, but imaginative ones. Close your eyes and picture the classic image. Peasants in filthy rags, a mud-soaked village, rats scurrying under wooden wheels, and priests preaching fear. The sky is grey, the people ignorant, the world grim. But that picture, it's not complete, and much of it is false. Let's explore these myths one by one, gently pulling the threads apart. Myth 1. Everyone thought the world was flat. This is perhaps the most persistent falsehood. The truth. Medieval scholars, especially those trained in church schools, knew the earth was round. They had read Aristotle. They had seen lunar eclipses. Sailors navigated by the curvature of the sea. The flat earth idea was a 19th century invention, used to mock the so-called ignorance of earlier times. But those earlier times weren't so ignorant after all. Myth 2. Hygiene didn't exist. The unwashed medieval masses, another myth. Yes, plumbing systems were primitive compared to Roman aqueducts. But people bathed when they could. In towns, bathhouses existed well into the later Middle Ages. Monasteries had rules for washing. Herbal soaps were used. And even nobles had elaborate routines for grooming. Perfumes, combs, scented waters. It wasn't modern cleanliness, but it wasn't total filth. Myth 3. No one lived long. It's true that average life expectancy was lower, often in the 30s, but that number is skewed by high infant mortality. If a person survived childhood, they had a good chance of reaching 60 or even 70. There were elders, grandparents, storytellers. Wisdom didn't disappear with youth. Breathe that in. The old still walked among the young. Myth 4. There was no innovation. The Middle Ages were far from stagnant. Windmills were developed. The heavy plow revolutionized farming. Water wheels powered mills. Eyeglasses were invented in the 13th century. Gothic architecture soared skyward, pushing the boundaries of stone and light. Cathedrals weren't just churches. They were blueprints of ingenuity. Myth 5. It was only war, plague, and religion. Yes, those things were real. Crusades burned. Disease ravaged. Faith ruled. But so did art. Laughter, games, music, romance. There were love poems, courtly love, written by troubadours in Occitan. Festivals burst with color and song. There were jokes, taverns, board games carved from bone. Life was hard. But it was not joyless. And even the faith we see as oppressive had nuances. Monasteries preserved books. Churches offered sanctuary. Many priests were educators and healers. There was fear, yes, but there was also comfort. Let your mind wander through a medieval village now, not as a museum of misery, but as a living place. Children chasing geese. A blacksmith hammering sparks into the dusk. A woman weaving cloth, humming softly. A fiddler playing beneath a tree as the sun sets behind the fields. The myth of misery was painted later, by those who wanted contrast, to make their own age shine brighter by dimming what came before. But history isn't a theater stage with light and dark sides. It's a candlelit manuscript. One page faded, the next illuminated. You're safe in this moment, breathing gently, letting go of the weight of modern myths. The past isn't something to be feared, it's something to be re-understood. Let your breath settle like dust in an ancient cathedral. The candles flicker, the bell tolls, and we walk now into the great stone halls of power, where knowledge, faith, and control converged. We are entering the domain of the medieval church. To many, the church is what defines the Middle Ages. Its towers rose above every town, its Latin tongue threaded across kingdoms. Its calendar governed the rhythm of life, feasts and fasts, births and deaths, seasons and saints. And with that influence came a great responsibility, and a great temptation. Power. Let's not rush to judgment though. The medieval church was not one thing. It was a complex living system, a web of bishops, abbots, monks, nuns, friars, scribes, and pilgrims. At its best it sheltered the poor, healed the sick, and preserved the past. At its worst, it censored, controlled, and shaped the story that would be told. Breathe in, exhale. To understand the church's role in the so-called Dark Ages, we must understand its unique position. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the church became the most stable institution in Europe. While kings came and went, popes remained. While cities burned, monasteries endured. As a result, the church became the gatekeeper of knowledge. In a world where most people could not read, where books were rare and hand-copied, those who could read, monks, priests, and scholars, held immense influence. They chose which texts to copy, which to discard, which to revise. Imagine a scriptorium, rows of silent monks, heads bowed over vellum, the scratching of quills, the scent of ink, a candle gutters. Outside, rain taps on the slate roof. These monks preserved Plato and Augustine, they copied Galen and Cicero. But sometimes, they edited, they reinterpreted, they left out what conflicted with church teachings, not with malice, but with intent. History was filtered, through theology, through doctrine, through belief. And that is where the shadows creep in. Take ancient Greek science. Much of it contradicted Christian ideas about creation, the soul, or the cosmos. And so it was pushed to the side, or saved only in fragments. Or take pagan myths. The epics of the Norse, the tales of Celtic heroes. Many were lost, dismissed as heathen. What remains often comes from Christian scribes writing generations later. This wasn't a conspiracy in the modern sense. It was worldview preservation. To the medieval church, truth was not just about facts, it was about faith. Let that thought settle. Now consider this. When later generations looked back at the Middle Ages and saw darkness, they were often seeing the results of this controlled narrative. They said, no new knowledge came from this time. But the truth is, much knowledge wasn't allowed to surface, or was preserved only in forms approved by church authority. And yet, even within that constraint, brilliance bloomed. Cathedrals were built with mathematical precision. Gregorian chants explored the physics of harmony. Monks experimented with herbs, minerals, and healing. And beneath it all, ordinary people carried their own forms of wisdom, oral traditions, seasonal knowledge, the law of the land. Not all knowledge wears a crown or a robe. Some whispers through kitchens, some grows in gardens, some dances in the circle of firelight. As you drift deeper now, imagine two stories running side by side. One, the official story, written in Latin, sealed in wax. The other, the lived story, told in lullabies, carved into doorframes, passed from grandmother to grandchild. Both are real, both are history. The darkness was never total, it was only directional. And those directions, more often than not, were drawn by power. Breathe in deeply and let your mind drift forward in time. Past the monasteries, past the plagues, past the kings and crusades. The candles are burning brighter now. Because just over the horizon, a new age is dawning. And it will claim to be the light that finally ends the darkness. We call it the Renaissance. But what if the Renaissance wasn't just a rebirth? What if it was a rebranding? Let your body relax as we move into this new chapter of history, one of brilliant artists, ambitious thinkers, and very selective memory. The Renaissance, meaning rebirth, began around the 14th century, blooming first in Italy. Florence, Venice, and Rome became centers of art, wealth, and scholarship. Thinkers like Petrarch, Boccaccio, and later Machiavelli celebrated the revival of Greek and Roman culture. They looked back across time and called the space in between dark. They needed a contrast, something to rise from, and so the 1,000 years before them became the Middle Ages. A name chosen not for accuracy, but for utility. It was the middle, the in-between, something to be climbed over to get back to the brilliance of antiquity. A narrative was born. Rome fell, everything went black. Then Florence lit the match. But that wasn't quite true. Because even as Petrarch collected classical manuscripts, monks in Ireland and Byzantium had been copying them for centuries. Even as Leonardo sketched his flying machines, Arab scholars had been experimenting with aviation long before him. Even as Renaissance painters rediscovered perspective, medieval builders had already designed cathedrals that reached toward the heavens. But this version of the past didn't fit the story Renaissance elites wanted to tell. They weren't just artists, they were revolutionaries. And to be revolutionary, you must claim what came before was broken, or worse, meaningless. So they dimmed the lights behind them. They labeled the era that birthed them as ignorant, barbaric, superstitious, and in doing so, they created a powerful myth that nothing of worth happened between the fall of Rome and the rise of Florence. That progress had paused, but progress never really pauses, it just changes form. Let your breath slow here, because this is where the cover-up takes root. Not in lies but in omissions, not in destruction but in redirection. The Renaissance needed a villain, and it made the Middle Ages wear the mask. There were practical reasons too. By dismissing medieval culture, Renaissance thinkers elevated their own work. Patrons funded artists who claimed to be restoring lost greatness. Cities gained prestige by linking themselves to ancient Rome. Kings gained legitimacy by tying their power to ancient ideals. Everyone benefited from rewriting the past. And yet even as they cast shadows over the Middle Ages, the Renaissance borrowed from it constantly. Gothic cathedrals still stood. Latin still dominated education. Religious authority remained powerful. Many Renaissance scholars were clergy themselves. The line between ages was far blurrier than the story suggests. It always is. So as you relax deeper now, drifting further into calm, remember this. Historical periods are inventions. Labels. Containers we build around time. But time doesn't know it's in the middle. Time just flows, one life into the next, one idea into another, and the so-called Dark Ages, they were part of the current, not a break from it. The Renaissance may have held the pen, but it didn't write the whole story. Settle into the warmth of this moment. The fire is low, the world quiet. And here, in this stillness, let's take a walk, not through myth or metaphor, but through reality. What did the Dark Ages really look like? Not the version told in textbooks or twisted into shadows, but the lived experience. The earth beneath the feet. The smells, the sounds, the rhythm of the everyday. Close your eyes and imagine a village in 9th century Europe. The morning begins with soft light through mist. A rooster crows. Hearth smoke rises from thatched rooftops. A mill wheel creaks beside a flowing stream. Children chase each other across fields of rye. A woman kneels by a river to wash linens, humming softly. There are no skyscrapers, no neon lights, no ticking clocks. But there is life. And there is structure. Villages had elders, councils, and shared customs. Families built longhouses or timber cottages. Walls were made from wattle and daub. Woven branches covered in clay. Roofs were thatched with straw. Inside, the hearth was the heart of the home. It cooked meals, heated water, lit the darkness. Around it, generations gathered to tell stories, mend clothes, braid hair, and whisper prayers. Let your breath follow the fire's gentle rhythm. Not far away, the manor house stood, home to the local lord. His domain might include several villages, fields, and forests. In exchange for land and protection, peasants gave a share of their harvest or worked the fields. This was the feudal system. Not fair, not free, but more nuanced than often portrayed. There were markets on feast days, musicians who wandered from town to town, fairs where spices, fabrics, and stories from far-off lands passed from hand to hand. People weren't frozen in fear or silence. They adapted, innovated, dreamed. In towns, blacksmiths hammered iron, tanners cured hides, carpenters built carts and coffins, each piece carved with care. The sounds of labor were familiar. Hammers, bells, footsteps on cobblestones. Smells were rich and earthy. Fresh bread, wet wool, herbs, soil, smoke, sometimes less pleasant ones too. In monasteries, chants echoed off stone walls. In fields, wind rustled wheat. In forests, wolves called to the moon. And in between it all, love, grief, celebration, birth, death. All the things that make life life. Now shift your focus to the minds of the time. Yes, most people could not read. But they memorized deeply. Oral storytelling was a revered tradition. Generations carried legends, histories, and sacred truths by heart. And for those who could read, the world opened. Imagine holding a manuscript, bound in leather, the pages thick with ink. Illuminated letters shine with gold leaf. A monk's handwriting curls like ivy along the margins. Each book took months, sometimes years, to complete. Knowledge wasn't absent. It was slower, quieter, handcrafted. Now imagine the garments of the age, not all rags, but wool tunics, linen shifts, cloaks dyed with plants, madder root for red, woad for blue, walnut husks for brown. Jewelry was made from bone, glass, bronze. Shoes were stitched by hand. Food was simple but varied. Stews with barley and beans, flatbread, ale, cheese, apples in autumn, herbs from the garden. There were no supermarkets, but there was seasonal wisdom, a knowing of when to plant and when to harvest, of which herbs soothed a fever and which ones helped you sleep. You feel yourself slowing now, as if walking through one of those fields. The so-called Dark Ages had music. Fiddles, flutes, chants, lutes. Songs sung during work, at weddings, around fires. There was art, tapestries, carvings, stained glass and illuminated scrolls. The Lindisfarne Gospels, for example, an explosion of color and sacred geometry, made in a quiet monastery far from Rome or Paris. And even amidst war and disease and hardship there was hope. Not every life was short, not every day was dark. The world didn't forget how to dream. It simply dreamed differently. So tonight remember this. The past isn't only what you're taught, it's what people lived. And those lives were full of color, complexity, and quiet strength. The Dark Ages weren't dark at all. They were dimly lit, and full of stars. The night deepens, your breath is calm, and the question lingers in the air like distant thunder. Was the idea of the Dark Ages ever real, or was it history's biggest cover-up? A narrative so widespread, so repeated, that it became fact, not through evidence, but through convenience. Let's trace the shape of this idea. It begins with the Renaissance, as we've explored, a time of rediscovery, of rebirth, of bold thinkers and beautiful cities. But every rebirth needs a death. And so the 1,000 years that preceded the Renaissance were branded a void, a failure, a forgotten time that needed to be rescued by modernity. This version of history suited many agendas. Let yourself settle deeper into your blankets, because this is where history becomes myth. During the Enlightenment, philosophers and scientists, eager to champion reason over faith, needed a foil. They painted the Middle Ages as a time of religious oppression, of intellectual stagnation, a dark tunnel between the light of Rome and the brilliance of Newton. Later, in the 19th century, colonial empires embraced this view as well. They used it to justify their own expansion, saying, "We are the light bearers. We bring civilization where there is only darkness." The Dark Ages became a rhetorical tool, a way to draw a line between us and them, between before and after, between ignorance and enlightenment. But history is not a contest, and truth does not belong to the loudest voice. So was this story constructed? In many ways, yes. Not through some grand conspiracy, not through secret meetings in candlelit rooms, but through something much quieter. Convenience, power, pride. The Renaissance wanted to claim glory. The Enlightenment wanted to sever ties with the past. And modern textbooks wanted simplicity. It's easier to teach clean timelines. It's easier to inspire awe by painting earlier times as backward. It's easier to turn the lights off, breathe in, now out. The Dark Ages label served a narrative that humanity was rising from a slump, climbing toward progress, becoming ever more enlightened. But that idea, that progress is linear, is itself a myth. History doesn't move in a straight line. It swirls, it pauses, it regresses, it leaps, it forgets, and remembers. And the truth is, progress often comes at a cost. When Rome fell, some knowledge was lost, but others were freed. Old ideas made room for new faiths. Forgotten herbs became healing cures. Oral traditions took the place of scrolls. And while some technologies vanished, others, like the moldboard plow or mechanical clock, emerged. Every Dark Age has its own hidden light. The real cover-up isn't that the Middle Ages were backward. It's that they were rich, diverse, and essential, and we were taught to forget. We were taught that modern life sprang from nothing, that Rome collapsed, the world slept, and suddenly, Leonardo was painting the Mona Lisa. But the truth lies in the spaces between. In the scribes who copied scrolls without credit. In the mothers who passed down healing knowledge. In the woodworkers who carved sacred symbols into the beams of churches. In the travelers who traded not just goods but stories, songs, spices and stars. These people were not lost, they were written out. Tonight as you rest, allow that truth to settle over you. That the dark ages were never truly dark. That the biggest cover-up in history was how brilliant they really were. And now we return not to the beginning, but to a softer place. A place where the echoes of centuries rest gently beside you. The myths are quieter now. The candle burns low. And the darkness, it doesn't feel so dark anymore. Because you've walked through it. Not with fear, but with understanding. The Dark Ages, a phrase whispered across centuries, passed through textbooks, echoed in conversation, and yet, never quite true. What we've uncovered tonight isn't just a forgotten era. It's a reminder that history is not a line we follow, it is a story we shape, and sometimes, that story is rewritten, not to deceive, but to simplify, not to hide, but to highlight something else. But we are wiser now. We know that even in times of turmoil, there is resilience. Even in silence there is song. Even in shadow there is light. Breathe in, and let it go. Let your mind return briefly to the hands that once held quills in candlelit monasteries, to the voices that sang through stained glass chapels, to the footsteps that passed over stone bridges, carrying goods and gossip, memory and meaning. Let your thoughts drift to the quiet wisdom of farmers who read the weather in the wind, to the laughter of children playing with wooden toys beneath mossy trees, to the hush of the scriptorium, to the warmth of the hearth. This is what the past truly looked like. Not dark, just different. And so we reclaim it, not as a void, but as a thread, a golden thread running through time. We pull gently on it, and it connects us to those who came before, not in legend, but in life. There is no single villain who erased this past, no grand plot, only choices, assumptions, narratives that benefited from contrast. But now, you've seen behind the curtain. You've heard the quieter version of history. And you know that the Dark Ages were never empty, they were never silent, they were never lost, just unloved. Until now. So let that knowledge soothe you. Let it nestle into your breath, slow and steady. Let it hum quietly beneath your dreams. You are not alone in this world, nor in its story. You are part of a long, winding line of memory, one that stretches not from light into darkness, but from one form of light into another. History's greatest cover-up. Maybe it was forgetting that every age holds beauty, that every person matters, that time doesn't erase, it transforms. So sleep now. Sleep, knowing that the world has always turned, that stars have always shone, and that even the dimmest ages left behind a glow. Good night.